Welcome, traveller of time, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Whether you're resting after a long day or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful to have you here. Do let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is for you. I imagine us as glowing dots on a spinning globe, connected by curiosity and the hush of night. And if this peaceful storytelling brings a little stillness to your day, feel free to subscribe. We'll have many more historical tales to share. Now, imagine waking up before dawn to the sound of church bells, not for morning prayers, but for another day of educational torture. Picture yourself as a young student in medieval Europe, where learning wasn't just difficult, it was downright brutal, where teachers weren't educators, but enforcers, wielding birch rods like weapons of mass instruction. This is the world of medieval schools, where the phrase, "spare the rod, spoil the child," wasn't just a saying, it was the entire curriculum. Today's students complain about pop quizzes and standardized tests, but medieval students faced a gauntlet of horrors that would make detention look like a spa day. We're talking about an educational system so harsh, so unforgiving, that simply surviving to graduation was an achievement worthy of sainthood. Over the next while, we'll explore why medieval schools were essentially training camps for misery, where knowledge was beaten into students' heads, quite literally, and where the pursuit of learning came with a side of psychological trauma. From the moment a medieval student set foot in their schoolhouse, they entered a world governed by fear, pain, and the constant threat of violence. These weren't places of enlightenment and discovery, but institutions designed to break the human spirit in service of creating obedient scholars. The very foundations of medieval education were built on principles that would horrify modern educators and traumatize today's helicopter parents. But what made these schools so uniquely terrible? What turned the noble pursuit of knowledge into a medieval house of horrors? The answer lies in a perfect storm of religious extremism, social hierarchy, and pedagogical methods that belonged more in a torture chamber than a classroom. Medieval schools operated under the belief that suffering was not just inevitable, but necessary for proper learning. Pain was pedagogy, and the more a student suffered, the more virtuous their education was considered. Let's start with the physical environment itself. Medieval schools were typically single-room stone buildings, cold and drafty, with no heating except perhaps a small fire that provided more smoke than warmth. Students sat on hard wooden benches for hours on end, their bodies slowly going numb from the cold and discomfort. The windows, if there were any, were small and offered little light, forcing students to strain their eyes in the perpetual gloom. These weren't learning environments. They were endurance tests designed to weed out the weak from the beginning. The school day began at sunrise with mandatory prayers, but this wasn't the gentle, reflective spirituality we might imagine. Students were required to recite complex Latin prayers from memory, and any mistake was met with swift and painful correction. The birch rod, that infamous symbol of medieval education, was never far from the teacher's hand. Made from bundled birch twigs, it was specifically designed to inflict maximum pain while leaving minimal permanent damage, allowing for repeated use throughout the day. But the physical punishment was just the beginning. The curriculum itself was a monument to monotony and mental torture. Everything was taught through rote memorization, with no room for creativity, questioning, or individual thought. Students spent hours chanting Latin grammar rules, mathematical tables, and religious texts until their voices were hoarse and their minds numb. The slightest deviation from the prescribed recitation earned immediate and severe punishment. The dominant teaching method was called beating knowledge into them. And this wasn't a metaphor. Teachers genuinely believed that physical pain helped information stick in students' minds. The theory was that if learning was associated with suffering, Students would remember their lessons more clearly. This led to a culture where being beaten was not just accepted, but expected as part of the educational process. Medieval teachers were often failed clergymen or monks who had been deemed unsuitable for higher religious positions. Frustrated by their own lack of advancement, they took out their anger and disappointment on their students. These men wielded absolute authority in their classrooms, answering to no parents, no administrators, and certainly no student welfare committees. They were educational dictators ruling over kingdoms of terror. The social hierarchy within schools was as rigid as medieval society itself. Students from noble families might receive slightly better treatment, but even they weren't immune to the rod. Peasant children, when they were allowed to attend at all, were treated as barely human. They were expected to arrive early, stay late, and endure punishment not just for their own mistakes, but sometimes for the mistakes of their betters. Books were incredibly rare and expensive, so most learning happened through oral recitation. Students had to memorize vast amounts of information without the aid of written materials, relying solely on their ability to retain what they heard. This created an educational system based entirely on fear of forgetting, where a lapse in memory could result in severe physical punishment. The curriculum was rigidly structured around the 7 liberal arts, divided into the trivium and quadrivium. The trivium consisted of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, while the quadrivium included arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. But these subjects weren't taught as intellectual explorations. They were hammered into students' heads through endless repetition and brutal enforcement. Latin was the language of instruction, regardless of students' native tongues. This meant that most students were learning complex subjects in a language they barely understood, creating an additional layer of confusion and frustration. Mistakes in Latin pronunciation or grammar were considered not just errors, but moral failings worthy of severe punishment. The school calendar followed the religious year, with lessons interrupted by numerous feast days and religious observances. But these weren't welcome breaks. They were often filled with additional religious instruction and punishment for any perceived irreverence during sacred periods. Even rest days became opportunities for educational torture. Discipline wasn't limited to academic failures. Students were punished for speaking out of turn, moving without permission, showing insufficient reverence during prayers, or displaying any sign of independent thought. The goal wasn't to nurture young minds, but to create perfectly obedient servants of the church and state. The psychological impact of this educational system was devastating. Students learned to associate knowledge with pain, curiosity with punishment, and questioning with severe consequences. This created generations of scholars who were technically educated but intellectually crippled, capable of reciting vast amounts of information, but incapable of original thought or creative problem solving. Teachers employed various forms of psychological warfare to maintain control. Public humiliation was a favorite tactic, with students forced to confess their ignorance before their peers. Dunce caps weren't just symbols of shame. They were instruments of social torture designed to isolate and embarrass struggling students. The grading system, such as it was, consisted entirely of punishment avoidance. There were no gold stars or certificates of achievement, only degrees of suffering based on performance. The best students were those who managed to avoid the rod for the longest periods, not those who demonstrated understanding or creativity. Medieval schools operated under the assumption that children were inherently evil and needed to have goodness literally beaten into them. This wasn't seen as cruel, but as necessary moral instruction. The pain inflicted by teachers was considered a form of purification, burning away sin and ignorance through physical suffering. The lack of any age-appropriate teaching methods meant that young children were expected to learn the same way as teenagers and adults. 6-year-olds sat alongside 16-year-olds, all subjected to the same harsh methods and impossible expectations. Childhood, as a distinct phase of development, wasn't recognized, and students were treated as miniature adults who simply hadn't learned to behave properly yet. Breaks were virtually non-existent. Students might be allowed brief moments to relieve themselves or drink water, but any extended rest was seen as laziness worthy of punishment. The idea that young minds needed time to process information or that physical activity might aid learning was completely foreign to medieval educators. The examination system was particularly brutal. Instead of written tests, students faced oral examinations where they were required to recite lengthy passages from memory while under intense pressure. A single mistake could result in starting over from the beginning, and multiple errors led to severe beatings. These weren't assessments of understanding, but tests of endurance and memorization ability. The physical conditions in schools were deliberately harsh. Cold, uncomfortable, and poorly lit environments were considered character building rather than obstacles to learning. The theory was that comfort led to moral weakness, so students needed to suffer physically to develop proper mental discipline. Medieval educators had no understanding of different learning styles or individual needs. Every student was expected to learn in exactly the same way, at exactly the same pace, using exactly the same methods. Those who struggled weren't seen as needing different approaches, but as being morally deficient and requiring more severe correction. The curriculum was entirely divorced from practical life skills or contemporary knowledge. Students spent years learning to parse Latin grammar while remaining ignorant of basic mathematics, science, or practical trades. The education system wasn't designed to prepare students for useful careers, but to create a class of learned clerks who could serve the church and nobility. Teachers received no training in pedagogy or child development. They learned their methods by enduring them as students, creating a vicious cycle where each generation of educators inflicted the same traumas they had experienced. Innovation in teaching methods was not just discouraged, but seen as dangerous deviation from proven traditions. The social isolation of medieval schools was complete. Students were cut off from their families for months at a time, living in conditions that resembled prisons more than educational institutions. They slept in unheated dormitories, ate meager rations, and had virtually no contact with the outside world. The psychological pressure was relentless. Students lived in constant fear of making mistakes, knowing that any error would be met with immediate and painful consequences. This created an atmosphere of terror that made genuine learning nearly impossible, as students were too frightened to take the intellectual risks necessary for real understanding. Medieval schools were also breeding grounds for bullying and abuse among students. Older students were given authority over younger ones, creating hierarchies of victimization, where those who had been brutalized passed that brutalization down to those below them. The school environment actively encouraged this cycle of abuse as a form of character building. The complete absence of parental involvement meant that students had no advocates or protectors. Parents who entrusted their children to these institutions had no say in how they were treated, and no recourse if abuse occurred. The school's authority was absolute and unquestionable. The religious indoctrination was intense and unrelenting. Students weren't just taught religious concepts. They were required to internalize a worldview that emphasized their own sinfulness and the necessity of suffering for spiritual growth. This created deep psychological scars that lasted long after their school years ended. The lack of any recreational activities or creative outlets meant that students' entire existence revolved around academic drudgery. There were no sports, arts, music for enjoyment, or any activities designed to develop well-rounded individuals. The goal was to create scholars, not human beings. Medieval schools were institutions of systematic dehumanization disguised as education. They took curious, energetic children and transformed them into fearful, obedient automatons through methods that would be considered torture by any modern standard. The miracle isn't that these schools produced some great scholars, but that any students survived with their love of learning intact. The legacy of medieval education continued to influence teaching methods for centuries after the Middle Ages ended. The assumption that learning required suffering, that students were inherently lazy and needed to be forced to study, and that questioning authority was dangerous persisted well into the modern era. Understanding this dark chapter in educational history helps us appreciate just how revolutionary modern child-centered teaching methods really are. The idea that learning should be enjoyable, that students should be encouraged to ask questions, and that education should develop the whole person rather than just create obedient servants, represents a complete reversal of medieval educational philosophy. The trauma inflicted by medieval schools wasn't just individual, it was cultural. Generations of leaders, clergy, and scholars were shaped by educational systems that emphasized obedience over creativity, conformity over innovation, and suffering over joy. This had profound effects on medieval society's ability to adapt, grow, and develop new ideas. When we look at the slow pace of intellectual and social progress during much of the medieval period, we can see the influence of educational systems that actively discourage the kind of thinking necessary for advancement. By crushing curiosity and punishing innovation, medieval schools created intellectual stagnation that lasted for centuries. The few great scholars and innovators who emerged from this system succeeded despite their education, not because of it. They had to overcome years of conditioning that taught them to fear knowledge rather than pursue it, to avoid questions rather than ask them, and to accept authority rather than challenge it. Medieval schools represent one of history's greatest educational failures, institutions that took the noble goal of spreading knowledge and turned it into a nightmare of suffering and oppression. They remind us that education without compassion, learning without joy, and knowledge without wisdom create not scholars, but victims. The next time you complain about homework, remember the medieval student who faced a beating for every mistake. The next time you question a teacher's methods, remember when such questioning would have earned you a flogging. But if you thought the physical brutality was the extent of medieval education's horrors, you'd be gravely mistaken. The psychological torment inflicted upon young minds was perhaps even more devastating than the welts left by birch rods and leather straps. These weren't just schools, they were factories designed to break the human spirit and rebuild it in the image of absolute obedience. Consider the daily reality of a typical student at a cathedral school in 13th century England. Young Thomas, barely 8 years old, was torn from his family's modest cottage and thrust into a world where every natural instinct was deemed sinful. His mother's tears as he departed would be the last tenderness he'd experienced for months, perhaps years. The moment Thomas stepped through those imposing stone doors, his childhood effectively ended. He was immediately stripped of his given name and assigned a Latin moniker, no longer Thomas the farmer's son, but merely Discipulus Tertius, third student. This wasn't mere administrative convenience. It was deliberate psychological warfare designed to erase individual identity and replace it with institutional conformity. Sleep became a luxury reserved for the dead. Students were roused before dawn by the harsh clang of bells, their bodies still aching from the previous day's beatings. They stumbled through freezing corridors to begin their morning prayers, not gentle supplications, but grueling recitations that lasted for hours. Miss a single Latin syllable, and the rod would find your back before the sun had even risen. The curriculum itself was a masterpiece of intellectual suffocation. Forget creativity, curiosity, or independent thought. These were viewed as dangerous heresies that threatened the very foundation of medieval society. Students spent endless hours memorizing vast passages of text they couldn't understand, in a language that bore no resemblance to their native tongue. The trivium, Grammar, rhetoric, and logic wasn't taught to expand minds, but to constrain them within acceptable boundaries. Grammar lessons were exercises in futility. Students would chant Latin declensions until their voices cracked, repeating mensa, mensa, mensum thousands of times without ever grasping that they were simply reciting the word for table. The master would prowl between the rows like a predator, his switch ready to strike any child whose pronunciation deviated by even the slightest margin. One misplaced accent could result in 20 lashes across the palms. But the true genius of medieval educational torture lay in its psychological manipulation. Students were constantly reminded that they were inherently wicked, born in sin, and deserving of every punishment they received. When young Thomas inevitably struggled with his Latin conjugations, he wasn't simply corrected. He was told that his failure was evidence of his moral corruption, that Satan himself was working through his ignorance. Students were given impossible tasks, translating complex theological texts without proper instruction, solving mathematical problems with incomplete information, debating philosophical points they hadn't been taught to understand. When they inevitably failed, they were beaten and told their failure was proof of their worthlessness. Over time, students learned to stop trying altogether, accepting that suffering was their natural state. Mealtimes, if they could be called that, were another form of systematic abuse. Students received meagre portions of gruel, stale bread, and water so foul it often made them ill. But even this pathetic sustenance came with conditions. They had to recite prayers between each spoonful, and any talking during meals resulted in the entire table being denied food for the remainder of the day. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at their bellies as relentlessly as fear gnawed at their minds. The dormitories were cramped, freezing chambers where dozens of boys slept on straw pallets, crawling with lice and fleas. Privacy was non-existent, dignity stripped away like everything else. Students were forbidden from speaking after the evening bell, but the silence was filled with the sound of muffled sobs as homesick children wept themselves to sleep. Perhaps most disturbing was the way these institutions deliberately fostered mistrust and betrayal among students. Masters encouraged pupils to report on each other's infractions, rewarding informants with slightly better food or fewer beatings. Brothers turned against brothers, friends became enemies, and the natural bonds of childhood were severed in favour of institutional loyalty. The psychological damage was compounded by the complete absence of emotional support. Students who showed signs of distress were labelled as weak and subjected to even harsher treatment. Tears were beaten out of them, laughter was discouraged as frivolous, and any display of joy was viewed with suspicion. These children learned to bury their emotions so deeply that many never recovered them, becoming hollow shells of human beings who could recite Latin perfectly, but had forgotten how to feel. Religious instruction, which should have provided comfort and hope, was weaponized into another tool of oppression. Students learned that God was not a loving father, but a wrathful judge who delighted in punishing sinners. Every natural human impulse, curiosity, playfulness, affection, was branded as sinful. They were taught that their bodies were temples of shame, that friendship was dangerous, and that questioning anything was tantamount to heresy. The masters themselves were often products of this same brutal system, passing down their trauma like a hereditary disease. Many had been broken so completely during their own education that they genuinely believed suffering was necessary for learning. They convinced themselves that their cruelty was kindness, that they were saving these children's souls through systematic torture. Writing lessons were particularly cruel exercises in futility. Students spent months learning to form letters with quills that were deliberately kept dull and ink that was often frozen solid in winter. Their fingers would crack and bleed from the cold, but they were forbidden from warming their hands lest they be accused of laziness. The parchment itself was precious and rare, so students practiced on wax tablets that could be erased. meaning that months of painstaking work could be wiped away in an instant if a master deemed it inadequate. Mathematical instruction was equally barbaric. Students learned to calculate using Roman numerals and primitive counting boards, systems so cumbersome that even simple arithmetic became torturous ordeals. The concept of zero hadn't yet reached most European schools, making mathematical operations needlessly complex. Students would spend hours attempting calculations that should have taken minutes, all while masters berated them for their stupidity. The rare books that existed in these schools were chained to desks, as if knowledge itself were a dangerous prisoner that might escape if not properly restrained. Students weren't allowed to touch these precious volumes. They could only look at them from a distance while masters droned through incomprehensible lectures. The very tools of learning were kept deliberately out of reach, ensuring that education remained a privilege of the masters rather than a right of the students. Logic lessons were exercises in circular reasoning designed to prevent actual logical thinking. Students learned to accept contradictions without question, to embrace paradoxes as divine mysteries, and to suppress any rational analysis that might lead to uncomfortable conclusions. They were taught that faith required the abandonment of reason, that questioning was the enemy of truth, and that intellectual curiosity was a form of spiritual pride. Rhetoric, supposedly the art of persuasive speaking, was reduced to memorizing predetermined arguments and approved phrases. Students weren't taught to think critically or construct original arguments. They were trained to be human parrots, capable of reciting approved positions, but incapable of independent thought. Any attempt at original expression was ruthlessly suppressed, branded as dangerous innovation. The daily schedule was designed to prevent any moment of rest or reflection. From dawn prayers to evening compline, every minute was accounted for, every activity supervised. Students moved through their days like automatons, following predetermined paths and performing prescribed actions. There was no time for friendship, no space for creativity, no opportunity for the natural development of young minds. Physical exercise, when it existed at all, was treated as punishment rather than recreation. Students might be forced to run laps while reciting Latin verses, or to perform calisthenics while masters critiqued their grammar. Even play was transformed into another form of educational torture, with games designed to reinforce lessons rather than provide genuine enjoyment. The psychological impact of this systematic abuse was profound and lasting. Students learned that authority was absolute and unquestionable, that suffering was inevitable and deserved, and that their own thoughts and feelings were dangerous liabilities. They internalized a deep sense of worthlessness that would plague them for the rest of their lives, even if they eventually escaped the confines of these educational prisons. Those who survived this brutal system often emerged as broken shells of human beings, their natural curiosity crushed, their creativity stifled, their capacity for joy permanently damaged. They had learned to read and write, yes, but at the cost of their humanity. They could recite Latin texts and perform mathematical calculations, but they had forgotten how to think for themselves or feel genuine emotions. The masters called this education, but it was really a form of institutional child abuse that would be recognized as such by any modern observer. These weren't schools in any meaningful sense. They were factories for producing compliant, unthinking servants of church and state, human beings stripped of everything that made them truly human. And perhaps most tragically of all, this wasn't considered unusual or cruel by medieval standards. This was simply how education was supposed to work, through fear, pain, and the systematic destruction of individual will. The very idea that learning could be joyful, that education could nurture rather than break the human spirit, was completely foreign to medieval thinking. The scars left by these educational practices extended far beyond the individual students who endured them. They shaped entire generations, creating a society of people who had learned to accept authority without question, to suppress their natural impulses, and to view suffering as not just inevitable, but necessary. Looking at the brutal realities we've already explored in medieval education, it becomes clear that the suffering didn't end when students finally left their schools. In fact, for many, graduation merely marked the beginning of an even harsher existence as they entered a world that viewed them as expendable commodities in an unforgiving economic machine. The transition from student to adult in medieval society was abrupt and merciless. Unlike today, where young people might enjoy a period of exploration or gradual independence, medieval graduates were immediately thrust into rigid social hierarchies that offered little hope of advancement. Most found themselves trapped in the same grinding poverty their families had endured for generations, their expensive education having done nothing to improve their prospects. For those who had suffered through years of brutal schooling only to become clerks or scribes, the disappointment was crushing. They discovered that their literacy, purchased through blood and tears, made them little more than human writing machines. These educated unfortunates spent their days hunched over manuscripts in dimly lit scriptoriums, their backs permanently curved from years of copying texts word by word. The irony was bitter. The very education that was supposed to elevate them had merely qualified them for a different kind of servitude. The lucky few who managed to secure positions in noble households or monasteries found that their education had prepared them perfectly for a life of intellectual submission. They were expected to use their hard-won knowledge not for innovation or creative thinking, but to reinforce the existing power structures that kept them subservient. A clerk who dared to question his lord's decisions or suggest improvements would quickly find himself back on the streets, his education worthless in a world that valued obedience above intelligence. Many graduates became wandering scholars, drifting from town to town in search of employment that would utilize their skills. These unfortunate souls, known as vagantes, lived lives of constant uncertainty and poverty. Despite their education, they were often viewed with suspicion by local authorities, who saw them as potential troublemakers. They slept in barns when they were lucky, under bridges when they weren't, and survived on whatever scraps of work they could find translating documents or teaching the children of merchants. The cruel mathematics of medieval economics meant that there were simply too many educated men chasing too few positions that required literacy. This oversupply of learned individuals drove wages down to starvation levels, creating a class of highly educated beggars who possessed all the knowledge of classical literature but lacked the means to buy their next meal. They could recite Virgil from memory while their stomachs cramped with hunger, compose elegant Latin verse while their shoes fell apart from walking endless miles in search of work. For those who attempted to use their education to challenge the established order, the consequences were swift and brutal. The same authorities who had demanded absolute submission in school showed no mercy to graduates who dared to think independently. Heretical ideas, even when expressed with scholarly precision and backed by careful reasoning, were met with imprisonment, torture, and execution. The education system had created minds capable of critical thinking, then systematically destroyed anyone who actually used that capability. The psychological toll of this betrayal was immense. Many graduates suffered what we might now recognize as severe depression, having invested years of their lives and endured tremendous suffering for an education that ultimately proved worthless. They had been promised that knowledge would set them free, only to discover that it had merely equipped them with the tools to understand their own powerlessness more clearly. Some turned to drink to numb the pain of their disillusionment, spending their meagre earnings in taverns where they could temporarily forget their circumstances. Others retreated into bitter cynicism, using their rhetorical skills to mock and satirize the very system that had created them. A few simply gave up entirely, abandoning their hard-won literacy to return to manual labor. their expensive education becoming nothing more than a source of shame and regret. The most tragic cases were those who had shown genuine intellectual promise, but found themselves trapped in positions that offered no outlet for their abilities. Brilliant minds that might have contributed to human knowledge were instead condemned to spend their lives copying recipes for soap or recording mundane business transactions. The waste of human potential was staggering, as generations of capable thinkers were systematically prevented from using their gifts for anything meaningful. Even those who achieved modest success often found that their education had isolated them from their communities. Their literacy set them apart from family members and childhood friends who viewed them with a mixture of resentment and suspicion. They belonged neither to the educated elite who looked down on their humble origins, nor to the common people who saw them as having abandoned their roots. This social isolation compounded their professional disappointments, leaving them friendless and alienated. The church, which had been responsible for much of their education, offered little comfort to these struggling graduates. Instead of providing support or opportunities, ecclesiastical authorities often viewed educated laymen as potential threats to their monopoly on learning. Priests and bishops jealously guarded their privileged position as interpreters of knowledge, ensuring that secular graduates remained subordinate and dependent. For the rare individuals who managed to secure teaching positions, the cycle of abuse simply continued. Having been brutalized as students, they often became brutal teachers themselves, perpetuating the same violent methods that had scarred their own childhoods. They justified their cruelty as necessary discipline, unable to imagine any alternative to the system that had shaped them so harshly. The economic reality facing these educated men was stark and unforgiving. While a skilled craftsman could expect steady work and reasonable compensation for his abilities, educated graduates found themselves competing desperately for a handful of positions that barely paid enough to survive. Their years of suffering through school had equipped them for careers that society barely valued, creating a permanent class of underemployed intellectuals who possessed impressive knowledge but lacked any real economic security. Many discovered that their expensive education had actually made them less employable than their uneducated peers. While an illiterate man could take up any manual trade and learn through apprenticeship, educated graduates were considered too refined for physical labor, but not well connected enough for prestigious positions. They found themselves trapped in a narrow middle ground where their skills were neither fish nor fowl, useful enough to keep them from starving, but not valuable enough to provide genuine prosperity. The psychological damage inflicted by years of educational trauma often manifested in their adult relationships and family lives. Men who had been systematically humiliated and beaten as students frequently struggled to form healthy emotional connections with others. The constant fear and anxiety that had defined their school years left lasting scars that affected their ability to trust, to love, and to find joy in life's simple pleasures. Perhaps most cruelly, many graduates found themselves unable to protect their own children from the same educational horrors they had endured. Despite knowing firsthand the brutality of medieval schools, they felt compelled to send their sons through the same system, convinced that education was still the only path to a better life. They watched helplessly as another generation suffered the same abuse, trauma, and ultimate disappointment that had defined their own lives. The bitter irony was that medieval education, for all its cruelty and inefficiency, had succeeded in one crucial way. It had created a permanent class of people who understood exactly how powerless they were. These graduates possessed the analytical skills to see through the lies and propaganda of their society, but lacked the political power or economic resources to do anything about it. They became living monuments to the futility of individual effort in a system designed to crush the human spirit. In the end, the true legacy of medieval schools wasn't the knowledge they imparted or the character they built, but the hope they systematically destroyed. They took bright, curious children and transformed them into broken adults who understood that learning and merit meant nothing in a world governed by birth, wealth, and brute force. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval education wasn't the physical beatings or the psychological torment. It was how these schools systematically crushed any spark of natural curiosity that children possessed. You see, medieval educators believed that knowledge was finite, already discovered, and their job was simply to force-feed this predetermined information into reluctant young minds. Imagine being a bright, inquisitive child who naturally wondered why birds could fly or how rainbows formed. In a medieval school, such questions weren't just discouraged, they were punished as signs of dangerous pride and disobedience. Students were taught that questioning established knowledge was tantamount to questioning God himself. The curriculum was rigid, unchanging, and brutally monotonous. Every single day followed the same soul-crushing pattern. Students would rise before dawn in their freezing dormitories, often sleeping on straw mattresses crawling with lice and bedbugs. They'd stumble through morning prayers in Latin they barely understood, then shuffle to their first lesson where they'd spend hours copying the same passages over and over again until their fingers bled from gripping crude quills. The teaching methods were designed to break down individual thought processes entirely. Students weren't encouraged to understand concepts. They were forced to memorize vast quantities of text through endless repetition. Picture spending 8 hours a day reciting Latin conjugations while a monk with a leather strap paced behind you, ready to strike at the first mispronunciation. There was no explanation of why these words mattered or how they connected to anything meaningful in life. Mathematics was taught as pure rote memorization, without any practical application. Students learned to calculate using Roman numerals, a system so cumbersome that simple arithmetic became torturous exercises in frustration. They weren't taught to think through problems or develop reasoning skills. Instead, they mechanically repeated calculation methods until they could perform them automatically, like trained animals responding to commands. The most devastating aspect was how schools deliberately separated learning from any sense of wonder or discovery. Natural philosophy, what we might call science today, was presented as a collection of unquestionable facts handed down by ancient authorities. Students learned that heavy objects fall faster than light ones, that the Earth was the center of the universe, and that illness was caused by imbalances in bodily humors. These weren't presented as theories to be tested or understood, but as absolute truths that must be accepted without question. Would face immediate and severe punishment. Teachers viewed curiosity as a form of intellectual rebellion that needed to be stamped out completely. They believed that children were naturally sinful, and that education's purpose was to beat this sinfulness out of them, replacing it with unquestioning obedience to authority. The psychological damage this caused was profound and lasting. Students learned to suppress their natural instincts to explore and question. They developed what we might recognize today as learned helplessness, a psychological state where people stop trying to escape painful situations because they've been conditioned to believe resistance is futile. Medieval students learned that thinking for themselves only brought pain, so they stopped thinking entirely. This systematic destruction of intellectual curiosity had devastating effects on medieval society as a whole. Entire generations grew up believing that knowledge came only from ancient authorities, and that human understanding could never advance beyond what had already been discovered. This mindset contributed to centuries of technological and social stagnation, where innovations that could have improved countless lives were dismissed as dangerous departures from established wisdom. The schools also used sophisticated psychological manipulation to maintain control. They deliberately fostered competition and mistrust among students, encouraging them to report on each other's infractions. Students learned that survival meant not just avoiding punishment themselves, but ensuring their classmates received it instead. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and betrayal that made forming genuine friendships nearly impossible. Teachers would often play favorites in the most arbitrary and cruel ways, showering praise on one student while systematically humiliating another for identical performance. This unpredictability kept students in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing whether they would face reward or punishment for the same behavior. Such psychological manipulation broke down students' sense of fairness and justice, teaching them that authority was arbitrary and that their worth as human beings depended entirely on the whims of those in power. The long-term consequences were staggering. Medieval schools produced adults who were intellectually passive, emotionally damaged, and utterly dependent on authority figures for guidance. These graduates went on to become the administrators, clergy, and leaders of medieval society, perpetuating the same oppressive systems that had crushed their own spirits decades earlier. Perhaps most tragically, these schools convinced students that learning itself was inherently painful and that intelligence was dangerous. Graduates often spent their entire adult lives avoiding intellectual challenges and discouraging curiosity in others. They became active participants in maintaining the very system that had brutalized them, believing it was the natural and proper way to educate children. The medieval education system was, in essence, a machine designed to transform bright, curious children into broken, compliant adults who would never question the social order that oppressed them. It succeeded brilliantly at this goal, creating generations of people who believed that suffering was not just inevitable, but necessary for proper development. And the most chilling aspect of all, many of these educational practices persisted for centuries, and echoes of them can still be found in authoritarian educational systems around the world today. The medieval belief that children must be broken before they can be molded continues to influence how we think about discipline, authority, and the purpose of education itself. This wasn't just bad teaching or primitive educational methods. This was a deliberate, systematic campaign to destroy human potential on a massive scale, justified by religious doctrine and maintained through institutionalized violence. Now let's continue exploring the brutal realities of medieval education, diving deeper into the systematic ways these institutions crushed the human spirit and stifled intellectual growth. Perhaps nowhere was the medieval school's oppressive nature more evident than in its treatment of students who dared to show any spark of creativity or independent thought. These unfortunate souls faced what can only be described as intellectual assassination. Teachers, drunk on their petty authority, would single out curious minds like predators hunting prey. A student who asked why, instead of simply memorizing, was marked for special punishment, subjected to humiliation, designed not just to hurt them physically, but to break their spirit entirely. The psychological warfare employed in these institutions was sophisticated in its cruelty. Students were pitted against each other in a system that rewarded conformity and punished excellence. Those who excelled too much faced the wrath of jealous peers, while those who struggled were abandoned to failure. The teachers fostered an atmosphere of mutual suspicion, where students would inform on each other for the slightest infractions, creating a toxic environment that poisoned friendships and destroyed trust. Consider the daily routine of a typical medieval student. Dawn would break with the harsh clanging of bells, jolting children from whatever brief respite sleep provided. There was no gentle awakening, no consideration for young minds that needed rest to develop properly. Instead, they were herded like cattle into cold stone chambers, where they would spend the next 12 to 14 hours in misery. The buildings themselves seemed designed to crush spirits. Windowless rooms that trapped stale air and the stench of unwashed bodies. walls that echoed with the sounds of weeping and the crack of switches against flesh. The curriculum was a masterpiece of intellectual starvation. Students spent years memorizing Latin texts they couldn't understand, reciting grammatical rules that had no practical application, and copying endless passages until their fingers bled and their eyes burned. Mathematics, when taught at all, consisted of rote memorization of tables and formulas with no explanation of underlying principles. Natural philosophy was strictly forbidden. Questions about how the world actually worked were considered dangerous heresy that could lead to excommunication or worse. But perhaps most insidious was how these schools systematically destroyed creativity and imagination. Art, music, and literature were permitted only in their most rigid, prescribed forms. A student who dared to compose an original poem or ask about different ways to solve a mathematical problem would face immediate and severe punishment. Innovation was treated as rebellion, curiosity as sin. The goal was not to educate but to indoctrinate, to produce compliant servants who would never question authority or think for themselves. The social hierarchy within these schools mirrored the brutal class system of medieval society, but with an added layer of academic cruelty. Wealthy students, regardless of their ability, received preferential treatment and faced lighter punishments. Poor students, even those with exceptional minds, were treated as disposable resources. They performed manual labor to pay for their education, cleaning the very rooms where they were beaten, scrubbing floors with hands already raw from copying texts, all while being reminded constantly of their inferior status. Teachers in these institutions were often failed scholars themselves, bitter men who had been rejected by universities or monasteries and took out their frustrations on helpless children. They wielded their authority like weapons, using fear and pain to maintain order, because they lacked the skill or knowledge to actually educate. Many were barely literate themselves, teaching from rote memory and responding to any question beyond their limited knowledge with violence. The long-term psychological damage inflicted by these educational prisons cannot be overstated. Generations of children emerged from these schools with their natural curiosity beaten out of them, their confidence shattered, their ability to think critically permanently impaired. They had learned to fear knowledge rather than seek it, to avoid questions rather than ask them, to conform rather than innovate. This wasn't education. It was systematic intellectual abuse that stunted human development for centuries. The tragedy is that this wasn't accidental, but intentional. Medieval schools were designed to produce exactly this result: broken individuals who would never challenge the existing order, who would accept their assigned place in society without question, who would pass on their trauma to the next generation. They were factories for creating human sheep, and they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, contributing to the intellectual stagnation that characterized much of the medieval period. Even the few students who somehow managed to preserve some spark of curiosity or creativity found themselves isolated and persecuted. They learned to hide their intelligence, to pretend ignorance, to bury their questions deep inside, where they festered like wounds. Some went mad from the constant suppression of their natural human desire to learn and grow. Others simply gave up, allowing their minds to atrophy rather than face continued punishment for the crime of thinking. The physical environment of these schools was deliberately harsh and uncomfortable, designed to associate learning with suffering. Students sat on hard wooden benches for hours without relief, their backs aching, their legs cramping, forbidden to move or stretch. The cold was bitter in winter, the heat stifling in summer, but comfort was considered a weakness that would make students soft and rebellious. Food was scarce and often spoiled, water was frequently contaminated, and medical care was non-existent. But just imagine for a moment what it was like to be dragged from your warm bed before dawn, your stomach already gnawing with hunger from yesterday's meager rations. Picture yourself trudging through the mud toward yet another classroom where fear hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. This wasn't just education. This was systematic psychological warfare waged against children who had committed no crime, other than being born into families that couldn't afford anything better. The masters who ruled these halls weren't content with mere physical punishment. No, they understood something far more sinister about breaking the human spirit. They knew that true control came from destroying a child's sense of self-worth, from convincing them that they were inherently worthless, stupid, and deserving of whatever cruelty was inflicted upon them. Every morning brought fresh humiliations designed to crush any spark of curiosity or independent thought that might dare to flicker in a young mind. Take the daily ritual of recitation, for instance. Students weren't just expected to memorize their lessons. They were forced to stand before the class and regurgitate Latin phrases they barely understood, while their classmates watched like vultures, waiting for the inevitable mistake that would bring down the master's wrath. The boy who stumbled over a conjugation would find himself bent over a wooden bench while the entire class counted the strokes of the birch rod. But the real torture wasn't the physical pain. It was the knowledge that tomorrow it could be any one of them standing in that same position. The masters had perfected the art of public humiliation. They would deliberately ask questions they knew certain students couldn't answer, then mock them mercilessly when they inevitably failed. "Perhaps your thick skull is better suited for the fields than the classroom," they would sneer, while other students nervously shifted in their seats. Grateful it wasn't them, but terrified their turn was coming. These weren't isolated incidents of cruelty. They were calculated strategies designed to keep every child living in a constant state of anxiety and self-doubt. And God help the student who showed any sign of creativity or original thinking. Medieval schools weren't interested in nurturing young minds. They were factories for producing obedient drones who would never question authority or think beyond the narrow confines of their predetermined roles in society. A boy who dared to ask why things were done a certain way, or who suggested there might be a better approach, would quickly learn that curiosity was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. The psychological manipulation extended far beyond the classroom walls. Students were encouraged to inform on each other, to report any infractions or signs of rebellion they witnessed. This created an atmosphere of paranoia where no one could trust anyone else. Friendships became weapons that could be turned against you at any moment. A whispered joke about a master, a shared complaint about the food, even a moment of homesickness expressed to the wrong person could result in severe punishment. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of all. These children were cut off from their families for months at a time, forbidden from receiving letters or visits that might remind them of love and warmth. The masters understood that breaking family bonds was essential to their mission of creating compliant subjects. Students were taught that their parents had sent them away because they were disappointments, that their suffering was proof of their own inadequacy rather than evidence of institutional cruelty. Even sleep offered no respite from the psychological torment. Dormitories were deliberately uncomfortable, with thin straw mattresses that provided little warmth against the constant chill. But worse than the physical discomfort was the knowledge that the masters could burst in at any moment for surprise inspections, searching for contraband items like letters from home or small personal treasures that might provide emotional comfort. These midnight raids weren't about maintaining order. They were about ensuring that students never felt safe, never knew a moment of peace or privacy. The few students who managed to maintain some spark of defiance found themselves targeted for special attention. Masters would assign them impossible tasks, then punish them for failing to complete the impossible. They would be forced to stand in corners for hours, holding heavy books above their heads until their arms shook with exhaustion. They would be denied meals and forced to watch their classmates eat while their own stomachs cramped with hunger. These weren't punishments for specific infractions. They were systematic campaigns of psychological destruction designed to break the strongest spirits. Perhaps most insidiously, the schools convinced students that they deserved this treatment. Through constant repetition of their worthlessness, through daily reminders of their supposed stupidity and moral failings, through endless comparisons to more successful students, the masters gradually wore down any sense of self-worth their victims might have possessed. Students began to internalize the abuse, to believe that they truly were as worthless as they were told, that their suffering was justified because of their inherent inadequacy. The religious instruction, which supposedly formed the moral foundation of medieval education, was twisted into another instrument of psychological control. Students were taught that their suffering was God's will, that questioning their treatment was tantamount to questioning divine authority. They were told that their masters were God's representatives on earth, that obedience to these cruel men was a sacred duty. Any rebellion, any resistance, any expression of unhappiness was framed as sinful, as evidence of moral corruption that required even harsher punishment to correct. The few moments of supposed recreation were carefully controlled to prevent any genuine joy or camaraderie from developing. Games were structured to create competition rather than friendship, with winners rewarded and losers punished. Even these brief respites from academic torture were designed to reinforce the school's fundamental message that life was about domination and submission, that there were winners and losers, and that most students were destined to be losers. The cumulative effect of this systematic psychological abuse was devastating. Students learned to suppress any expression of personality, creativity, or independent thought. They became experts at reading the moods of their tormentors, at anticipating what would trigger punishment, and desperately trying to avoid it. They developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of severe trauma: hypervigilance, emotional numbness, an inability to trust others, and a deep, abiding sense of worthlessness that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Many students simply broke under the pressure. They would be found weeping uncontrollably in corners, unable to speak or respond to questions, their minds having retreated to some unreachable place where the pain couldn't follow. These broken children were often sent home in disgrace, labeled as failures who couldn't handle the rigors of proper education. Their families, not understanding what had been done to them, often saw their return as shameful evidence of weakness rather than recognizing it as escape from systematic abuse. The truly tragic irony was that this wasn't education at all. Nothing meaningful was being learned in these halls of suffering. Students weren't developing critical thinking skills or gaining knowledge that would serve them in adult life. They were simply being conditioned to accept authority without question, to suppress their natural curiosity and creativity, to see themselves as fundamentally flawed and unworthy of happiness or success. The actual academic content was almost secondary to this primary mission of psychological control. The masters justified their cruelty by claiming it was necessary to prepare students for the harsh realities of adult life. They argued that breaking a child's spirit was essential for molding them into proper citizens who would know their place in society and never challenge the established order. But this was merely a convenient rationalization for systematic abuse. The reality was that these schools were designed to perpetuate existing power structures by ensuring that the next generation would be too psychologically damaged to imagine or fight for a better world. The long-term consequences of this educational trauma extended far beyond the school walls. Former students carried their psychological wounds into adulthood, often becoming the very masters who would inflict similar abuse on the next generation of victims. The cycle of trauma was self-perpetuating, creating a society where cruelty was normalized and emotional damage was passed down like a hereditary disease. But perhaps even more insidious than the physical brutality and psychological terror was how these medieval schools systematically destroyed the very essence of human curiosity and learning itself. You see, the medieval educational system wasn't just content with breaking bodies and spirits. It had to obliterate the mind's natural capacity for wonder, discovery, and creative thought. Think about how a child naturally learns. They ask endless questions. Why is the sky blue? How do birds fly? What makes flowers grow? They experiment. They play. They imagine wild possibilities. Their minds are like sponges, absorbing everything with infectious enthusiasm. But medieval schools took these bright, curious children and turned them into hollow, obedient automatons who had learned that questions were dangerous and imagination was sinful. The curriculum was designed with surgical precision to kill intellectual curiosity. Every subject was reduced to mindless memorization of approved texts. Students weren't taught to think about the meaning behind Latin phrases. They were beaten until they could recite them perfectly without understanding. Mathematics wasn't about solving problems or discovering patterns. It was about mechanically following procedures without deviation. Geography wasn't about exploring the wonders of distant lands. It was about memorizing lists of place names that meant nothing to them. But here's where it gets truly diabolical. The masters didn't just discourage questions. They made questioning itself a moral failing. They wasn't just being difficult. They were being prideful, disobedient, possibly even heretical. The very act of intellectual curiosity was reframed as a character flaw that needed to be beaten out of them. Imagine being a 12-year-old boy who naturally wondered about the world around him, only to be told that such wondering was evidence of your spiritual corruption. This systematic destruction of curiosity created what we might call intellectual learned helplessness. Students learned that their own thoughts and observations were worthless, that all knowledge worth having had already been written down by ancient authorities, and that their job was simply to absorb and regurgitate without question. They were taught that independent thinking was not just unnecessary, but actively dangerous, a path that led to heresy, social disorder, and eternal damnation. The effects went far beyond the classroom. These students grew up to become adults who had never learned how to think critically, how to solve novel problems, or how to question authority. They became the perfect subjects for a rigid feudal system that depended on unthinking obedience. When faced with new challenges, whether a crop disease, a technical problem, or a social injustice, they had no intellectual tools to address them. They had been trained to look to authority for all answers, never to seek solutions themselves. Consider the tragic waste of human potential this represented. Among those brutalized students were undoubtedly future inventors, philosophers, scientists, and artists, whose gifts were systematically crushed before they could flourish. How many potential innovations were lost because children were taught that questioning established methods was sinful? How many medical advances were delayed because students learned to accept ancient texts as infallible rather than testing them against observation? How many social reforms were postponed because people had been conditioned never to imagine that things could be different? The schools also destroyed what we might call emotional intelligence. Students learned to suppress not just their intellectual curiosity, but their emotional responses as well. They were taught that feelings of compassion, empathy, or moral outrage were weaknesses to be overcome. When they saw injustice, they learned to accept it. When they felt empathy for suffering, they learned to suppress it. When they experienced joy or wonder, they learned to hide it as inappropriate. This emotional suppression created adults who were capable of perpetuating and participating in systems of cruelty without apparent distress. The master who had been brutalized as a student could brutalize his own students without visible conscience because he had learned to disconnect from his natural human empathy. The cycle of abuse wasn't just physical and psychological, it was spiritual and intellectual, creating generations of people who had lost touch with their own humanity. The irony is staggering. These institutions claimed to be centers of learning, but they were actually factories for the production of ignorance. They claimed to serve God and moral education, but they systematically destroyed the very capacities, love, compassion, wonder, justice, that every religion claims to cherish. They claimed to prepare students for adult life, but they crippled their ability to adapt, innovate, or solve problems. Even more perversely, the system was self-perpetuating in its intellectual destruction. Because questioning was forbidden, no one could point out the obvious contradictions and failures of the educational methods. Because students were taught that their own observations and reasoning were worthless, they couldn't recognize that they were learning nothing of value. Because independent thinking was branded as dangerous, no one could suggest improvements or alternatives. The masters themselves were often victims of this same intellectual destruction. Many of them genuinely believed they were providing their students with the best possible education because they had never been taught to question, to compare alternatives, or to evaluate effectiveness. They had learned their teaching methods through the same brutal system and had never been encouraged to wonder whether there might be better ways to help children learn. This created what we might call institutional intellectual blindness. The schools continued using methods that obviously didn't work, producing students who couldn't think, couldn't solve problems, couldn't adapt to new situations. But because the system had eliminated the very capacity for critical evaluation, no one could see the failure for what it was. It was like a society of blind people insisting they had perfect vision. The long-term consequences extended far beyond individual students. These schools were training the future leaders, clergy, administrators, and scholars of medieval society. By systematically destroying their intellectual capacity, the schools were crippling the entire civilization's ability to progress, adapt, and improve. This wasn't just educational malpractice, it was cultural suicide on a massive scale. And perhaps most tragically, this intellectual destruction was often irreversible. A child's natural curiosity and creativity, once systematically crushed, rarely recovered fully even if they later escaped the system. The neural pathways for independent thinking, once atrophied through years of enforced passivity, struggled to redevelop. The confidence to trust one's own observations and reasoning, once destroyed by years of punishment for thinking, seldom returned completely. The medieval school system didn't just fail to educate, it actively miseducated. It didn't just neglect to develop human potential, it systematically destroyed it. And it didn't just maintain ignorance, it manufactured it with industrial efficiency. These weren't schools in any meaningful sense of the word. They were intellectual slaughterhouses, grinding up the minds and spirits of children to serve the needs of a system that valued obedience above all else. The true horror of medieval schools wasn't just what they did to individual students, though that was horrific enough. But the true horror of medieval schools wasn't just the physical punishment or the rote memorization. It was how these institutions systematically destroyed something far more precious than flesh and bone. They crushed the very essence of childhood itself, methodically stripping away wonder, curiosity, and joy until nothing remained but hollow shells of obedience. Consider young Thomas, a bright-eyed boy of 7, whose parents had scraped together enough coin to send him to the cathedral school at Winchester. Thomas arrived with questions burning in his mind. Why did birds fly south in winter? How did the smith make iron bend to his will? What lay beyond the horizon where the sun disappeared each night? These were the natural wonderings of a child's mind, the spark of inquiry that should have been nurtured and celebrated. Instead, Thomas learned his first lesson within hours of arrival. Questions were not welcome. When he dared to ask why Latin verbs changed their endings, the master's rod came down across his knuckles with such force that the crack echoed through the stone chamber. "You are here to learn, not to question," the master snarled. The message was unmistakable. Curiosity was dangerous. Wonder was weakness. The only acceptable response to authority was silent, unthinking compliance. Day after day, Thomas and his fellow students were subjected to what can only be described as intellectual waterboarding. They chanted Latin conjugations until their voices cracked and their minds went numb. They copied scripture until their fingers bled and their vision blurred. They recited mathematical tables with the mindless precision of trained parrots, never understanding why or how these numbers related to the world around them. The masters had perfected a system of educational terrorism that went far beyond mere corporal punishment. They understood that to truly break a child's spirit, you had to destroy their sense of self-worth. Students were ranked not just by their academic performance, but by their absolute submission to authority. The boy who asked too many questions was labelled prideful and arrogant. The child who struggled with memorization was deemed lazy and worthless. The student who showed any hint of independent thought was marked as rebellious and dangerous. This psychological warfare was deliberate and methodical. The masters knew that a curious child might grow into an adult who questioned the established order. A creative child might envision a world different from the rigid hierarchy that kept the powerful in their places. An independent thinker might challenge the very foundations of medieval society. Such possibilities could not be tolerated, so they created an educational system designed to produce not scholars, but servants, not thinkers, but automatons, not human beings, but tools to be used by their betters. The curriculum itself was a masterpiece of intellectual stagnation. Students spent years memorizing vast quantities of information without ever being taught to analyze, synthesize, or apply what they learned. They could recite Aristotle's writings word for word, but were forbidden from questioning his conclusions. They memorized mathematical formulas, but were never shown how these might be used to solve real problems or understand the natural world. This wasn't education. It was indoctrination masquerading as learning. The goal wasn't to develop young minds, but to lobotomize them, to create graduates who would never think to challenge authority or imagine alternatives to the status quo. The social dynamics within these schools were equally toxic. Students were encouraged to spy on each other, reporting any sign of independent thought or rebellion to the masters. Friendships were discouraged as potential sources of dangerous ideas. Trust was systematically eroded until each child stood alone, isolated and vulnerable to the constant psychological pressure. Those who showed the slightest spark of creativity or original thinking faced special torment. They were subjected to public humiliation rituals designed to crush their spirits completely, made to stand before their classmates while the master catalogued their failings, their stupidity, their worthlessness. These sessions could last for hours, with the victim forced to repeat self-deprecating phrases until they internalized the message of their own inadequacy. The most insidious aspect of this system was how it made victims complicit in their own destruction. Students learned to police their own thoughts, to suppress any hint of curiosity or creativity before it could surface. They became their own jailers, carrying the psychological chains of the medieval classroom long after they left its physical confines. Many never recovered from this educational trauma. They grew into adults who were afraid to think, afraid to question, afraid to imagine. They became the perfect citizens of a society built on unquestioning obedience to authority. They raised their own children with the same spirit-crushing techniques they had endured, perpetuating the cycle of intellectual oppression across generations. The lucky few who escaped these institutions often found themselves psychologically crippled, unable to trust their own minds or believe in their own worth. They had been so thoroughly convinced of their intellectual inadequacy that they never attempted to learn or grow beyond what their masters had deemed acceptable. This was the true legacy of medieval education. Not the small number of scholars it produced, but the vast multitude of human potential it destroyed. Countless brilliant minds were snuffed out before they could flower. Innumerable innovations and discoveries were lost because the children who might have made them were taught that thinking was dangerous and creativity was sin. The medieval school system didn't just fail to educate, it actively worked to prevent education, to maintain ignorance, to preserve the rigid social order that benefited those in power. It was a machine designed to manufacture compliant subjects, not thinking citizens. The devastating psychological warfare waged by medieval schools extended far beyond their stone walls, seeping into every aspect of a child's developing mind like poison through water. These institutions didn't merely educate, they systematically dismantled the very essence of childhood curiosity, replacing wonder with fear, questions with silence, and dreams with resignation. Consider the daily reality of a typical medieval student. Each morning began not with excitement for learning, but with dread. The heavy wooden doors of the schoolhouse might as well have been the gates of a prison, for once inside, children entered a world where their natural impulses were treated as sins to be beaten out of them. The masters, often failed clerics or bitter scholars who had never achieved their own ambitions, took out their frustrations on these young minds with a cruelty that would shock modern sensibilities. The curriculum itself was designed to break spirits rather than build knowledge. Latin grammar wasn't taught as a gateway to understanding great works of literature, but as an endless series of arbitrary rules to be memorized through repetition so mind-numbing that children would often fall asleep, standing up, only to be awakened by the sharp crack of a birch rod across their backs. Mathematics wasn't presented as a tool for understanding the world, but as abstract torture, with problems deliberately designed to confuse and frustrate rather than illuminate. But perhaps most insidious was the way these schools corrupted the very concept of learning itself. In the natural world, children learn through play, exploration, and joyful discovery. Medieval schools inverted this completely, making learning synonymous with pain, confusion, and humiliation. Students learned to associate the acquisition of knowledge with punishment, creating a psychological barrier that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. How many potential scholars, inventors, or philosophers were lost because their first experience with formal education taught them that learning was their enemy? The masters employed psychological techniques that modern interrogators would recognize as sophisticated torture methods. They would deliberately ask questions they knew students couldn't answer, not to gauge understanding, but to create opportunities for punishment. They would pit students against each other, encouraging them to report on classmates who whispered or showed signs of independent thought. This created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that poisoned friendships and turned the classroom into a battlefield where survival meant betraying others. The physical environment reinforced this psychological assault. Medieval schoolrooms were deliberately designed to be uncomfortable and intimidating. Stone floors that numbed feet during long hours of standing. Windows placed too high to offer any glimpse of the outside world that might spark imagination. And walls bare of anything that might inspire or comfort. The only decorations were often instruments of punishment, displayed prominently as constant reminders of what awaited those who stepped out of line. Even more damaging was the systematic suppression of creativity and individual expression. Students were forbidden from asking questions that weren't specifically permitted, from expressing opinions that differed from established doctrine, or from showing interest in subjects deemed inappropriate for their station in life. A peasant child who showed aptitude for mathematics might be beaten for getting above themselves, while a noble child who struggled with Latin would be humiliated for failing to live up to their supposed natural superiority. The schools also served as breeding grounds for the very authoritarianism that plagued medieval society. Students learned not just to accept arbitrary authority, but to crave it. After years of having every decision made for them, every thought pre-approved, and every action regulated, many graduates found themselves psychologically incapable of independent thought or action. They became perfect subjects for tyrannical rulers and corrupt clergy, having been trained from childhood to never question, never resist, and never think for themselves. The damage extended into every aspect of adult life. Former students often became the most rigid and unforgiving parents, passing on the trauma they had experienced to their own children. They sought out authoritarian structures in their work and worship, finding comfort in the familiar patterns of dominance and submission they had learned in school. Many became enthusiastic supporters of oppressive systems, not because they benefited from them, but because questioning authority had been so thoroughly beaten out of them that they literally couldn't conceive of alternatives. Perhaps most tragically, these schools destroyed the natural human capacity for wonder and discovery that drives all genuine learning and progress. Children who had once marveled at butterflies, asked endless questions about the stars, and created elaborate games and stories, emerged from medieval schools as hollow shells, their curiosity replaced by rote compliance, and their creativity smothered under layers of fear and conditioning. The religious justification for this systematic abuse made it even more insidious. Masters could claim they were saving souls while destroying minds, beating children for their own good, while serving their own sadistic impulses. This religious veneer made resistance nearly impossible, as questioning the school meant questioning God himself, a blasphemy that could result in excommunication or worse. The long-term consequences of this educational approach rippled through generations. Societies that subjected their children to such systematic psychological assault produced adults incapable of innovation, critical thinking, or moral courage. This helps explain why the medieval period saw such slow progress in science, philosophy, and human rights. When your educational system is designed to produce obedient sheep rather than thinking human beings, stagnation becomes inevitable. The medieval school system stands as perhaps history's most successful experiment in mass psychological manipulation. It proved that with enough violence, intimidation, and systematic abuse, you could take the most naturally curious and creative beings on earth, children, and transform them into compliant automatons who would never again dare to question, explore, or dream. The fact that this was done in the name of education makes it all the more obscene. These institutions didn't just fail to educate. They actively worked against education, creating generations of traumatized adults who associated learning with pain and authority with truth. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval schooling wasn't the beatings or the rote memorization or even the deliberate crushing of curiosity. No, the most devastating element was how these institutions weaponized shame and humiliation to create what we might recognize today as learned helplessness. Picture this: a 12-year-old boy, already malnourished and exhausted from helping his family scrape together enough grain to survive another harsh winter, stumbles into the schoolhouse each morning, knowing with absolute certainty that he will be publicly degraded before the day is through. The master doesn't just beat incorrect answers out of children. He orchestrates elaborate theatrical productions of humiliation designed to break their spirits so completely that they never again dare to question, explore, or dream. Take young Edmund, son of a village blacksmith, whose only crime was asking why Latin verb conjugations followed certain patterns. The schoolmaster didn't simply ignore the question or provide a curt dismissal. His classmates, terrified of receiving similar treatment, were encouraged to laugh and jeer at each repetition. By the end of that day, Edmund had learned a lesson that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Curiosity equals pain. questions lead to suffering, and the safest path through existence is silent, unthinking compliance. This wasn't accidental cruelty born from ignorance or frustration. This was systematic psychological warfare designed to produce a very specific type of adult, one who never questions authority, never seeks to understand the world beyond what they're explicitly told, and never ever believes they have the right to think for themselves. The schoolmasters had studied human nature with the cold calculation of torturers. They understood that physical pain heals, but psychological wounds fester for decades. A child beaten for giving the wrong answer might still harbour secret thoughts of rebellion. But a child systematically convinced of their own fundamental inadequacy, their inherent stupidity, their complete unworthiness to participate in the realm of ideas, that child grows into an adult who polices their own thoughts, who crushes their own curiosity before it can even fully form. The genius of this system lay in its self-perpetuating nature. Children who survived this psychological demolition didn't just become compliant adults. They became enthusiastic enforcers of the same brutal system that had broken them. They would tell their own children that education was a privilege they didn't deserve, that questioning was sinful, that thinking was dangerous. Entire generations passed down trauma disguised as wisdom, ensuring that each new cohort of children arrived at school already primed for intellectual destruction. Consider the case of young Margaret, daughter of a wool merchant, who showed remarkable aptitude for mathematics. In a different world, in a different time, she might have become a brilliant scholar, perhaps contributing to advances in commerce or even natural philosophy. But when Margaret began solving problems in her head faster than her classmates could work them out on their wax tablets, her schoolmaster saw not potential, but threat. A girl who could think independently was a girl who might one day question why women were forbidden from participating in trade, from owning property, from having any say in the decisions that governed their lives. So Margaret's mathematical gifts were not nurtured or celebrated. Instead, they became the instrument of her intellectual execution. The master began giving her increasingly complex problems, not to challenge and develop her abilities, but to engineer her failure. When she inevitably encountered a problem beyond her current knowledge, he didn't use it as a teaching moment. Instead, he held up her confusion as evidence of the fundamental impossibility of female intellectual achievement. "See how Margaret's mind crumbles when faced with true complexity," he would announce to the class. Night after night, Margaret would return home and secretly practice mathematics by candlelight, desperately trying to prove to herself that she wasn't the intellectual failure her teacher proclaimed her to be. But the damage was already done. The seed of self-doubt had been planted and watered daily with fresh humiliation. By the time Margaret left school, she had internalized the message so completely that she would spend the rest of her life apologizing for having thoughts, dismissing her own insights as probably wrong, and actively discouraging other women from pursuing learning. The system had successfully converted a potential mathematical prodigy into an agent of its own perpetuation. The schoolmasters had discovered something that modern psychologists would later formalize as learned helplessness. The phenomenon whereby individuals subjected to repeated, inescapable trauma eventually stop trying to escape even when escape becomes possible. Children learned that no matter how hard they studied, how desperately they tried to please, how perfectly they memorized their lessons, they would still be found wanting. The standards were deliberately impossible, the goalposts constantly moving, the criteria for success perpetually undefined. This wasn't education. It was systematic conditioning designed to produce humans who believed effort was pointless, improvement impossible, and their own agency an illusion. The most heartbreaking aspect of this psychological destruction was watching children's natural wonder slowly drain away like life leaving a dying animal. 7-year-olds would enter these schools with eyes bright with curiosity, hands raised eagerly to share observations about the world around them, minds bubbling with questions about everything from why birds could fly to how numbers worked to where the sun went at night. These same children would emerge years later as hollow-eyed adolescents who had learned to keep their heads down, their mouths shut, and their thoughts safely hidden away where they couldn't cause trouble. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. First, children learned not to volunteer answers unless specifically called upon. Then they learned not to ask questions that went beyond the immediate lesson. Next, they discovered that showing enthusiasm for learning marked them as targets for extra punishment. Finally, they internalized the ultimate lesson. Thinking itself was dangerous, curiosity was sinful, and the safest way to navigate life was to become as intellectually invisible as possible. But the medieval education system's true masterstroke wasn't just crushing individual spirits. It was creating a culture where intellectual destruction was seen as moral virtue. Parents who might have questioned other forms of abuse were told that breaking their children's will to think was actually saving their souls. The church provided religious justification, explaining that human reason was inherently corrupted by sin, and that true wisdom came only through unquestioning acceptance of divine authority as interpreted by earthly representatives. The nobility, meanwhile, had their own reasons for supporting this intellectual genocide. A population trained from childhood to never question authority was a population that would never challenge the fundamentally unjust distribution of wealth and power that kept them in luxury while millions starved. Why risk the possibility that education might lead to revolution when you could instead use education as a tool to prevent revolution? Far better to teach children that their suffering was divinely ordained, their poverty a test of faith, their powerlessness a natural law as immutable as gravity. And so medieval schools became factories of intellectual death, taking in curious, creative, thinking human beings and outputting compliant automatons who had learned to fear their own minds. The tragedy wasn't just individual, but civilizational. Imagine how many potential innovations were strangled in their cribs, how many scientific discoveries were prevented, how many artistic masterpieces never came to be because the minds that might have created them had been systematically destroyed before they could flower. The ripple effects of this educational holocaust extended far beyond the classroom walls. Entire societies stagnated because they had eliminated the very human capacity for progress. Innovation requires individuals willing to question existing methods, to imagine better alternatives, to risk failure in pursuit of improvement. But medieval schools had turned questioning into trauma, imagination into sin, and risk-taking into evidence of dangerous pride. The result was civilizations trapped in amber, unable to evolve because they had murdered the psychological mechanisms that make evolution possible. Perhaps most chilling of all, this system was so successful that it became self-concealing. Generations of intellectually broken adults couldn't recognize the damage that had been done to them, because the very capacity for recognition had been systematically eliminated. They genuinely believed that curiosity was dangerous, that questioning was evil, that their own thoughts were untrustworthy. They weren't pretending to be satisfied with intellectual slavery. They had been so thoroughly conditioned that they experienced their own mental chains as freedom, their ignorance as wisdom, their compliance as virtue. This is the true horror of medieval education. It didn't just fail to teach children. It didn't just waste human potential. It actively and systematically destroyed the very psychological foundations that make learning, growth, and human flourishing possible. The medieval schools of Europe were, quite simply, instruments of systematic human destruction, masquerading as centers of learning. These wretched institutions represented the culmination of centuries of psychological warfare against the young, a deliberate campaign to crush every spark of curiosity, creativity, and independent thought that might threaten the established order. As we've explored the brutal machinery of medieval society, from the grinding poverty of the peasantry to the iron grip of feudal lords and the suffocating control of the Catholic Church, we now witness how this same oppressive system reached its most insidious expression in the very places meant to nurture young minds. The schoolmasters of medieval Europe were not educators, but executioners of the human spirit. Armed with birch rods, leather straps, and an arsenal of psychological torments, they transformed bright-eyed children into cowering automatons who learned that questioning authority was a sin punishable by agony. Every lesson was delivered through fear, every concept hammered home with violence, every natural impulse toward wonder systematically beaten out of trembling young bodies. The classroom became a torture chamber where knowledge was not discovered, but imposed through terror. Consider the daily routine that awaited any child unfortunate enough to enter these halls of horror. Before dawn, they were roused from their straw pallets by the harsh clanging of bells, their young bodies already aching from the previous day's beatings. Stumbling through the darkness, they gathered in cold stone chambers where the very architecture seemed designed to crush their spirits. The walls pressed in around them. The narrow windows offered only glimpses of a world they were forbidden to explore freely, and the heavy wooden benches reminded them of their place as mere vessels to be filled with approved thoughts. The curriculum itself was a masterpiece of intellectual stagnation. Latin grammar was drilled into their heads through endless repetition, each mistake met with a swift blow from the master's rod. They memorized passages from ancient texts without understanding, recited prayers in languages they could not comprehend, and absorbed lessons that bore no relation to the world around them. Mathematics was reduced to rote calculation, natural philosophy was dismissed as dangerous speculation, and any attempt to connect learning to lived experience was ruthlessly suppressed. But the true genius of these educational gulags lay not in what they taught, but in what they destroyed. Every question that began with why was met with violence. Every spark of curiosity was extinguished with shame. Every attempt at creative expression was branded as heretical deviation from approved forms. The children learned quickly that survival depended not on understanding, but on perfect mimicry. Not on thinking, but on mindless obedience. They discovered that their own thoughts were dangerous, their natural impulses sinful, their very personalities obstacles to be overcome. The psychological techniques employed were sophisticated in their cruelty. Public humiliation was a favorite tool, with children forced to confess their intellectual failures before their peers. The dunce cap was not merely a symbol, but a ritualized degradation ceremony, marking the wearer as fundamentally flawed and worthy only of contempt. Competition was fostered not to inspire excellence, but to turn children against each other, creating an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety, where academic failure meant social death. The masters themselves were often products of this same system, broken men who had internalized their own abuse and now perpetuated it with zealous dedication. They spoke constantly of the children's innate wickedness, their natural tendency towards sin and error, their desperate need for correction and control. Love of learning was portrayed as pride, intellectual curiosity as dangerous arrogance, and independent thought as rebellion against God himself. The children learned to hate their own minds, to distrust their own perceptions, and to seek validation only through the approval of their tormentors. The physical violence was relentless and methodical. Beatings were administered not in moments of anger, but as calculated interventions designed to associate learning with pain. Children were struck for incorrect answers, for asking unauthorized questions, for showing enthusiasm for forbidden subjects, and sometimes simply to maintain the proper atmosphere of fear. Their hands were swollen from repeated canings. Their backs bore the marks of countless lashings, and their spirits carried wounds that would never fully heal. The social hierarchy within these institutions mirrored and reinforced the broader medieval caste system. Children of nobles received marginally better treatment while still being broken to the system's will, while peasant children faced additional humiliations based on their lowly birth. The message was clear: some were born to rule and others to serve. And education's role was not to develop human potential, but to ensure everyone accepted their predetermined place in the cosmic order. The religious indoctrination was perhaps the most insidious element of all. Children were taught that their suffering was divinely ordained, that their natural impulses were manifestations of original sin, and that questioning authority was tantamount to questioning God. They learned to see themselves as fundamentally corrupt beings whose only hope lay in absolute submission to their betters. The concept of individual worth, of human dignity, of the right to think and choose for oneself was systematically eradicated from their consciousness. The long-term effects of this educational holocaust were precisely what the system intended. Generations of adults emerged from these schools with their capacity for critical thinking permanently impaired, their creativity strangled in infancy, and their ability to envision alternative ways of living thoroughly destroyed. They became willing participants in their own oppression, passing down the same patterns of abuse to their own children, creating an endless cycle of psychological destruction that kept medieval society locked in stagnation for centuries. These schools produced not scholars, but slaves, not thinkers, but automatons, not human beings, but hollow shells, programmed to perpetuate the very system that had destroyed them. They emerged into a world where questioning was forbidden, where innovation was heresy, where the imagination itself was seen as a dangerous faculty that threatened the stability of the social order. The medieval educational system was, in its essence, a machine for manufacturing consent, a factory for producing compliant subjects who would never dream of challenging the brutal inequalities that defined their world. The tragedy extends beyond the immediate victims to encompass the entire trajectory of human civilization. How many potential scientists, artists, philosophers, and reformers were crushed before they could flower? How many discoveries remained unmade? How many works of beauty uncreated? How many insights into the human condition lost forever because the educational system was designed to destroy rather than develop human potential? The medieval schools were not just a crime against individual children, but against the future itself. A systematic sabotage of human progress that kept entire civilizations trapped in darkness for generations. As we reflect on this educational nightmare, we must recognize that its legacy extends far beyond the Middle Ages. The fundamental assumptions that drove these institutions, the belief that children must be broken before they can be shaped, that learning requires suffering, that authority must never be questioned, and that human nature is fundamentally corrupt. These toxic ideas have infected educational systems throughout history and continue to poison young minds today. The medieval school was not an aberration, but a template, a blueprint for how power seeks to perpetuate itself by destroying the very capacity for independent thought that might challenge its dominance. The children who endured these horrors deserve our remembrance not as statistics, but as individual human beings whose potential was systematically destroyed in service of a system that valued obedience over understanding, conformity over creativity, and control over human flourishing. Their suffering was not an unfortunate byproduct of medieval education, but its very purpose, the deliberate sacrifice of human potential on the altar of social stability. And so we reach the end of our journey through the dark corridors of medieval learning, where young minds were systematically crushed beneath the weight of institutional brutality and ignorance. We have witnessed how these schools, masquerading as centers of education, were in reality factories of conformity, designed to strip away every spark of curiosity and wonder that children possessed. From the moment a child crossed the threshold of a medieval school, they entered a world where violence was not merely tolerated, but celebrated as a pedagogical tool. The rod ruled supreme, and with each lashing, each humiliation, each moment of terror, these institutions carved away pieces of the human spirit until only hollow shells remained. Teachers, drunk on their petty power, wielded their authority like weapons, finding perverse satisfaction in breaking the will of those entrusted to their care. The curriculum itself was a monument to intellectual stagnation, a rigid catechism of unquestionable truths that brooked no dissent, no exploration, no genuine learning. Students were not educated, but indoctrinated, not taught to think, but trained to obey. Every lesson was a lesson in submission. Every recitation, a ritual of intellectual surrender. The very act of questioning was branded as heresy, and original thought was beaten out of children before it could take root. These schools did not merely fail to educate, they actively destroyed the capacity for education. They took minds that sparkled with potential and systematically dimmed them until they could produce nothing but rote repetition. They transformed children who entered with boundless imagination into adults who could conceive of nothing beyond the narrow confines of their indoctrination. The damage was not accidental but deliberate, not a byproduct but the very purpose of the systems. Perhaps most tragically, these institutions convinced their victims that this brutalization was for their own good, that suffering was the price of knowledge, that humiliation was the path to wisdom. Students learn to internalize their oppression, to see their natural curiosity as a flaw to be corrected, rather than a gift to be nurtured. They emerged not as educated individuals, but as broken souls who had been taught to despise the very act of learning. The psychological wounds inflicted by these schools ran deeper than any physical injury. Children learned to associate knowledge with pain, discovery with punishment, creativity with transgression. They developed a learned helplessness that followed them throughout their lives, convincing them that they were fundamentally incapable of independent thought or original insight. The schools had succeeded in their true mission, creating a generation of people who would never question, never challenge, never dare to imagine a better world. The social consequences of this educational barbarism extended far beyond the classroom walls. These schools produced citizens who were perfectly suited to a rigid hierarchical society, individuals who had been so thoroughly broken that they could conceive of no alternative to their oppression. They became the perfect subjects for tyrannical rulers, having been trained from childhood to submit to authority without question and to accept suffering as their natural lot. Even those who managed to retain some spark of their original spirit found themselves isolated and alienated, unable to connect with a world that had been drained of wonder and possibility. The schools had created a culture of intellectual poverty where curiosity was seen as dangerous, creativity as subversive, and independent thought as the ultimate crime against the social order. The teachers themselves were often victims of this same system, having been so thoroughly brutalized in their own education that they could conceive of no other way to relate to their students. They perpetuated the cycle of abuse, not out of malice, but out of a profound inability to imagine that education could be anything other than a process of systematic destruction. They had been taught that learning required suffering, and they inflicted that suffering with the conviction that they were performing a sacred duty. The buildings that housed these schools became monuments to human misery, their walls echoing with the cries of generations of children whose spirits had been broken within them. The very architecture seemed designed to crush the human soul, with its dark corridors, cramped spaces, and oppressive atmosphere that reminded students at every moment of their powerlessness and insignificance. Yet perhaps the greatest tragedy of medieval schools was not what they did to individual students, but what they did to human civilization itself. By systematically destroying the capacity for innovation, creativity, and critical thinking, these institutions ensured that progress would be stifled for centuries. They created a dark age of the mind that lasted far longer than any political or economic crisis, a spiritual winter that froze the human capacity for growth and discovery. The legacy of these schools extended far beyond the medieval period, establishing patterns of educational abuse that would persist for centuries to come. They created a template for institutional violence that would be copied and refined by countless other systems of oppression, proving that the most effective way to control a population is to destroy their capacity for independent thought during childhood. In the end, medieval schools succeeded brilliantly at their true purpose, creating a world where the light of human curiosity had been systematically extinguished, where the natural joy of discovery had been replaced by the dull ache of resignation, and where the boundless potential of childhood had been crushed beneath the weight of institutional brutality. They were not schools at all, but factories of despair, designed to ensure that the human spirit would never again dare to soar. And so we close this dark chapter of human history, having witnessed the systematic destruction of everything that makes education truly meaningful. These were not places of learning, but chambers of spiritual execution, where the best and brightest aspects of human nature were put to death with methodical precision. They stand as a warning to all future generations about what happens when education becomes a weapon rather than a gift, when schools become prisons rather than sanctuaries, and when the noble goal of nurturing young minds is perverted into the ignoble practice of crushing them into submission. The medieval school was perhaps humanity's greatest crime against its own future, a deliberate sabotage of human potential that condemned countless generations to lives of intellectual poverty and spiritual emptiness. It reminds us that the greatest evil is not always found in dramatic acts of violence, but in the quiet, systematic destruction of the human capacity for wonder, creativity, and growth. These schools succeeded in creating exactly what they intended, a world where darkness reigned supreme and the light of human curiosity was forever extinguished.